The story that follows is one of the most chilling accounts to emerge from the northern wilderness, a tale that pushes the limits of human endurance and brushes against the very edge of death. It follows a man who found himself buried beneath crushing snow, immobilized, freezing, and slipping into hypothermia with each passing hour. But the cold wasn't the only threat stalking him. As he fought to stay conscious under the weight of winter itself, a starving bear prowled the snow-covered landscape around him, its instincts sharpened by hunger, its presence looming like a shadow of inevitable fate. The man, trapped between an unforgiving blizzard and a predator waiting for him to stop breathing, had to confront a truth no human ever wants to face. Sometimes survival is not just a battle against nature, but a negotiation with death that watches every step, every breath, every heartbeat. What you're about to witness is not a simple rescue tale. It is a psychological war waged in silence, in darkness, and in the paralyzing cold. A war against hypothermia, fear, and the terrifying awareness that a starving beast was only feet away, waiting for its moment. This is the kind of story that stays with you long after the last word is spoken. A story where survival becomes something raw, primal, and painfully real. Before you go deeper into this moment of chilling tension and desperate survival, take a second to join our community of people who love stories like this. Stories that grip the heart and make you hold your breath. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another survival story brought to life with this level of detail and immersion. Leave a like to support the work behind these narratives, and most importantly, comment below telling us from which country and city you're watching this video. Your comment helps this story travel across the world, reaching more people who appreciate tales of resilience and raw human courage. Now, with that said, let's return to the frozen silence where a man's life hung by a thread, and the only witness was a starving bear. The snowstorm had already swallowed the world by the time he realized how far he had wandered. What began as a routine trek through familiar terrain quickly devolved into a nightmare of whiteout conditions, disorientation, and deafening winds that stole his warmth breath by breath. As the storm intensified, he misjudged the depth of the snow beneath his feet, a single step too soft, a hidden shelf collapsing under him, and suddenly he was plunging downward through a hollow formed between rocks and drifted snow. The impact drove the air from his lungs and buried him beneath a suffocating blanket of ice crystals. The cold wrapped around him like a living thing, biting into his skin, numbing his fingers, slowing his pulse. Above him, the storm roared on, indifferent. Every instinct told him to fight, to claw his way upward, but his body refused to respond. He didn't yet know that something else was nearby, something desperate, starved, and silently watching through the ghostly blur of snow. The bear had been roaming the ridge for days, weakened by hunger and winter scarcity. Its ribs pressed against thinning fur as it lumbered through the trees, nostrils flaring as it searched for anything living, anything warm. The storm had wiped away scents and tracks, but then something new reached it. A faint trace of human presence carried by the swirling wind, curious, desperate, drawn. The bear moved toward the scent with slow, deliberate steps, its massive paws sinking into the snow. When it arrived at the broken drift where the man lay trapped beneath the surface, it paused, lowering its head. The faint sound of breathing, shallow, struggling, rhythmic, reached the animal's ears. A living creature lay buried there. The bear circled the mound, not attacking, not digging, simply watching with predatory patience. It was too weak for a fight and too exhausted for uncertainty. Instead, it waited, a watcher in the storm, bound to the man's fragile life by hunger. Beneath the snow, the man's mind flickered between consciousness and dreamlike haze. He sensed something close, an unsettling presence in the storm above him. He couldn't see it, but some primal instinct deep within recognized the feeling of being watched. His breath slowed, his limbs stiffened. Hypothermia blurred his thoughts, but terror sharpened one truth. He was not alone under the snow. Every sound became amplified, the shifting of wind, the groaning of branches, and somewhere nearby the faint crunch of heavy steps. A predator's steps. Fear coursed through him, warming him just enough to spark a final drive for life. If he didn't move, didn't find a way out soon, the cold would claim him, or the creature waiting above would finish the job. And so begins the journey you are about to hear. A week-long battle against cold, fear, exhaustion, and the watchful presence of a starving bear. A battle fought breath by breath beneath the snow. Long before the storm buried him beneath the snow, and long before the starving bear began watching his every fragile breath. Lucas Warren had always believed he understood the wilderness. Growing up in northern Alberta, he had spent his childhood hiking frozen rivers, climbing pine-shadowed ridges, and learning to navigate by instinct as much as by map. He knew the sound of shifting ice, the way the wind carried warnings through tree lines, and the strange calm that settled over the forest before a storm. But nothing he had learned, not from his father, not from the countless backcountry trips he had taken, not even from his training as a volunteer search and rescue scout, could have prepared him for the moment when nature itself turned on him. The storm that swallowed him was unlike anything he had ever imagined. A white curtain rising from the northwest, devouring the sky, erasing landmarks, and turning familiar trails into blind traps. Lucas left home that morning believing he was in control. By nightfall, he could no longer tell which direction the sun had set. This story begins not with a mistake, but with a misjudgment. One that even the most seasoned outdoorsman might have made. Yet for Lucas, that single misjudgment would spiral into a week-long nightmare where every heartbeat mattered, every breath froze in the air, and every sound above him hinted at the presence of a starving predator waiting for its chance. The region where Lucas ventured was known for its harsh winters, but also for its breathtaking beauty. Frozen lakes stretched like glass plains. Ancient spruces bowed under blankets of snow, and on clear days, the horizon glowed with a blue so sharp it felt carved from gemstone. It was the kind of wilderness that rewarded respect and punished arrogance. But Lucas had never been arrogant. He had always been cautious, methodical, and deeply aware of how quickly conditions could shift. He checked forecasts twice, packed emergency gear, and even left his brother a detailed itinerary. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day trek, nothing more than a personal challenge and a chance to clear his mind after a difficult winter of family stress and financial strain. But as Lucas would soon learn, the wilderness does not negotiate with preparation. It does not soften for experience. The storm that descended upon him moved faster than any alert system could warn, carving through the region with blinding force. By the time Lucas realized he was heading into the heart of it, visibility had dropped to mere feet, and the noise of the wind drowned out the world. As he pushed forward, hoping to reach a sheltered ridge he knew well, the ground beneath him collapsed. The snow had drifted deep around a fallen tree, forming a hidden cavity. In an instant, Lucas was swallowed by the earth, buried in an icy tomb that would become his prison for the next 7 days. What happened next would push him beyond the limits of endurance. Trapped under the snow, Lucas found that panic was his first enemy. The weight on his chest, the cold seeping through his coat, the pressure around his legs, it all triggered a primal terror that surged through him like electricity. But he forced himself to focus, to breathe, to remember every survival lesson he had internalized over the years. He conserved movement. He tracked his breaths. He resisted the urge to thrash. Yet as minutes blurred into hours and as temperatures dropped even lower, Lucas faced a new, more insidious opponent. Hypothermia. It crept through him slowly, first numbing his fingers, then blurring his thoughts, then pulling his awareness into a fog where sleep felt deceptively warm. But it wasn't the cold alone that threatened him. Somewhere above, unseen but not unfelt, something heavy moved through the snow. At first, Lucas thought it was the shifting storm, but then he heard it again, slow, deliberate steps, a rhythmic crunch, a soft huff carried by the wind. Something was circling the depression he had fallen into. Something alive. Weak as he was, Lucas recognized the cadence instinctually. A bear. And not just any bear, one moving without urgency, without aggression. One conserving energy. One starving. Unbeknownst to Lucas, the bear had been roaming the region for nearly a week in a desperate search for food. Winter had robbed it of berries, fish, and small game. Hunger gnawed through its ribs, hollowing its body and sharpening its instincts. In normal conditions, a bear might have ignored a buried human. Too much effort, too much uncertainty. But starvation rewrites the rules of behavior. When the storm began, the predator followed sheltering wind patterns, eventually wandering near the ridge where Lucas had fallen. There, hidden beneath layers of fresh snow, Lucas's scent escaped in faint, intermittent waves, just enough to stir the animal's attention. The bear didn't attack. It didn't dig. It simply hovered, circling, watching, waiting. Its breath formed thick clouds that drifted over the snowpack above Lucas's head. Each time the bear exhaled, tiny vibrations pulsed through the frozen crust, whispering to the man beneath it a truth he desperately didn't want to accept. He was being monitored, not by rescuers, not by fellow hikers, but by a starving creature torn between caution and desperation. The wilderness had become a stage upon which two life forces clung to survival. One trapped by nature, the other trapped by hunger. In the days that followed, Lucas would face challenges no human should ever endure. His body temperature continued to drop, sinking to levels that blurred consciousness with hallucination. Waves of fatigue pulled him under again and again, tempting him to sleep that would end everything, yet fear kept him awake. The constant presence above him, the intermittent sounds of the bear pacing, the awareness that he was the only warm-blooded creature within reach, it all fueled a fight for life that defied reason. Lucas had no way to signal for help, no way to climb out, no food, limited movement, and time was becoming his deadliest enemy. But even in darkness, even beneath layers of ice and snow, something inside him refused to surrender. He didn't know how long he had been trapped. He didn't know if anyone was looking for him. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. If he gave up, the cold or the creature above him would claim him. What Lucas didn't yet realize was that the bear was not the only thing moving through the storm. Far beyond the ridge, a faint beacon from his emergency locator had triggered a response, and a search party was already forming. Whether they'd reach him in time, however, was another question entirely. Lucas Warren had always believed that winter carried its own kind of sacred stillness, a quiet that wrapped the world in a white veil and forced a man to listen to the deepest chambers of his soul. But on that day, as the storm smothered the mountains with a violence that felt almost alive, the silence he encountered no longer felt holy. It felt predatory. The wind clawed at him with icy fingers, dragging away the warmth from his body until his bones trembled under his soaked layers. He had set out early, confident in his routine and the familiar trails he had walked 100 times before. But the storm that met him on the ridge was not described by any forecast. It came like a beast, sudden and merciless, and in minutes it had erased the world around him. Snow blew sideways, blinding him, erasing landmarks, stealing all sense of direction. In that moment, Lucas understood something he had never felt so strongly before. Nature didn't need to hate him to kill him. It only needed to be indifferent. He forced himself to take slow, steady breaths, each one slicing into his chest like cold glass. Lucas tried to replay the map in his mind, but the storm had twisted the landscape with such cruelty that memory felt useless. The trees he usually relied on as markers were blurred by the white curtain, transformed into distorted shadows that shifted with every gust. He had always prided himself on being calm under pressure, on knowing how to handle the wilderness. But the storm was stripping him of that calm, peeling away his confidence piece by piece. He stopped, crouched low, and pushed his hand into the snow, searching for his own footprints. They were already gone. He felt a tightening in his throat, fear, raw and rising, but he swallowed it back. Panicking wouldn't help him survive. He whispered a prayer, barely audible under the roar of the storm, asking God for clarity, for even the faintest direction. The prayer had hardly left his lips when he heard a sound behind him, a low, guttural crunch of snow. Lucas froze. The wind moaned around him, but beneath that cry was something else, a weight shifting, movement. He turned his head slowly, careful not to make any sudden motion that might provoke whatever was there. Through the white haze, he saw a shape, dark and immense, moving with a quiet urgency. At first he told himself it was just a trick of the snow, but then the shadow lifted its head. Two dark eyes stared at him with an intensity that pierced the blizzard. A bear, thin, starved, and watching him as though deciding whether he was a threat or prey. Lucas's breath hitched, fogging the air in front of him. He could feel the drum of his heartbeat in his ears. There was no more room for mistakes. He kept his eyes low, remembering the way his father had taught him to behave around bears. Never look directly into their eyes, never challenge them. But this bear wasn't like the ones he had quietly observed on past hikes. This one moved with desperation, not curiosity. Hunger had carved shadows along its ribs, its fur tangled with frost. Lucas took a step back, slow and deliberate. The bear didn't charge. Instead, it followed him with a strange, unnerving patience, as though the storm itself had tied their fates together. Lucas forced his legs to move, each step feeling heavier than the one before. He knew that running could trigger a chase, but staying in place meant freezing to death. He tried to walk diagonally down the slope, hoping to lose the bear's line of sight in the storm, praying the blizzard would hinder the animal more than it hindered him. But the snow was so thick that he could barely see his own hand, let alone a path. The ground betrayed him. His foot found no resistance, and he plunged knee-deep into a hidden pocket of snow. The sudden drop yanked him forward, and he struck the ground hard, his palms scraping against ice. A sharp pain shot up his wrist. Lucas gritted his teeth, pushing himself onto his elbows. Snow stung his face as he lifted his head. The bear was closer now, its breath fogging the air, its chest rising with shallow, ragged gasps. Lucas's mind raced. He had no weapon, no shelter, no escape. The bear took a slow step toward him, not aggressive but resolute. He pushed himself upright, forcing his body to move despite the tremor in his hands. He needed to stay calm. He needed to think. But every instinct screamed at him to run. He tried to create distance between them, stepping sideways through the thick blanket of snow. His legs were numb, not only from the cold, but from the weight of fear that pressed against his spine. The storm howled again, sending a violent burst of wind across the slope. Lucas squinted, trying to shield his eyes. When the gust passed, the bear was gone. He blinked hard, wiping the snow from his eyelashes. Nothing. Just white, endless and swallowing. Relief and dread tangled inside him. Had the bear retreated? Or was it circling? He turned slowly, searching the blizzard for any movement. Then he spotted it, farther to the right, the same dark shape still watching him. It was keeping pace with him, not attacking, not leaving, simply observing every step he took. Lucas couldn't understand why the bear behaved that way. It wasn't normal. It wasn't natural. He felt as though he were being studied, as if the starving creature saw something in him that he himself couldn't see. He wrapped his arms around his chest, trying to conserve what little warmth he had left. His fingers felt stiff, tingling painfully. Hypothermia was beginning its slow creep, numbing him from the inside. He had read enough survival manuals to know the signs. He needed shelter, anything that could block the wind. He forced his legs toward a line of trees that appeared like blurry phantoms in the distance. If he could make it to the forest edge, maybe he could find a hollow, a fallen trunk. Something. But with each step, his strength faded. The cold was invading him, burrowing into his muscles like thousands of icy needles. He stumbled again, catching himself against a rock hidden beneath the snow. A groan escaped him, half frustration, half exhaustion. Lucas tried to focus on breathing, but every breath felt shallow, thin, as if the mountain itself were stealing the air from his lungs. Behind him, he heard movement. He didn't need to turn to know what it was. The bear was still there. He wondered if it sensed his weakening state, if it understood that the storm was doing its work for it. But strangely, he didn't feel hunted. He felt accompanied, as though the creature walked behind him not with malice, but with a strange, unspoken recognition. The forest drew closer, but the world was growing dim. Black spots danced in his vision and his legs buckled beneath him. Lucas collapsed into the snow, the cold embracing him like a burial shroud. He tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled violently and gave out. He lay there gasping, snowflakes settling on his cheeks like tiny shards of ice. The storm roared around him, but he felt distant from the sound, as though a thick wall separated him from the world. Somewhere behind him, the bear stopped walking. Lucas could feel its presence, heavy and still, just beyond the blur of his failing sight. His thoughts grew sluggish, drifting. He remembered the warmth of his childhood home, the voice of his mother saying grace at the dinner table, the feeling of God's presence when he was young and unburdened. As the darkness thickened around him, Lucas whispered another prayer, not for escape, not for safety, but for strength to hold on to his faith even as his body surrendered to the cold. The storm seemed to quiet for a moment, a brief pause in its fury, and in that stillness he felt something unexpected. Peace. A warmth that did not come from his body, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere untouched by frost or fear. He didn't know if it was God's presence or the last flicker of consciousness, but it steadied him. Through the haze, he thought he saw the bear step closer, not menacing, but cautious, almost protective. Then the world went white, then black, and Lucas Warren surrendered to the silence beneath the snow. The darkness that swallowed Lucas Warren felt strangely gentle, like drifting into a sleep he had been resisting for years. But consciousness did not fully abandon him. Somewhere in that dim space between waking and oblivion, he sensed movement, slow, deliberate, and heavy. A warmth brushed against his side, something that did not belong in the frozen wilderness. He felt pressure, a weight settling near him, melting a thin layer of cold that clung to his body. His eyelids fluttered, but they would not fully open, as though the storm had placed invisible hands upon them, insisting he remain still. Lucas tried to move his fingers, but they felt distant, unresponsive. All he could do was listen. The storm still raged above him, but muffled, softened. Something massive was blocking the wind, shielding him from its fury. In the haze of half-consciousness, he wondered if this was the moment before death, or the moment before a miracle. Time lost its meaning. Minutes or hours passed. It was impossible to tell. But when Lucas finally managed to pry his eyes open the slightest bit, what he saw stole what little breath he had left. The bear. The same gaunt, starved creature that had followed him through the storm now stood only a few feet away. Snow clung to its fur like tiny pearls, its dark eyes fixed on him with an expression he could not understand. Neither hunger nor aggression. More like vigilance. The bear's massive body angled itself against the wind, forming a barrier between Lucas and the storm. Lucas blinked, unsure whether he was hallucinating. Animals did not behave like this. Not starving ones. Not in weather like this. Yet the bear remained, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of its labored breathing. Each breath was visible in the cold air, thick, uneven clouds that drifted toward Lucas, warming the space around him by mere inches. Lucas wanted to speak, but his lips barely parted. The cold had stiffened them until forming words felt impossible. Instead, a thin, raspy breath escaped him. The bear's ears twitched. It turned its head slightly, regarding him with a kind of weary curiosity. Lucas was too weak to feel fear. Instead, he felt something unexpected, an overpowering sense of humility. Here, in the vast indifference of the storm, a creature fighting for its own survival was choosing to stand beside him rather than abandon him. He closed his eyes again, not from exhaustion, but from a strange reverence for the moment. He felt the weight of a presence far greater than the bear, far greater than the storm, something sacred woven into the fabric of the wilderness. His father had always said that God could speak through anything, a whisper in prayer, a quiet moment before dawn, the rustle of leaves, even a stranger's kindness. But Lucas had never imagined God might speak through a starving bear. When Lucas drifted back into awareness, the storm had changed. Its roar had softened, replaced by the gentler hiss of snowfall rather than violent wind. The bear was still there, but now it lay on its belly, its massive front paws stretched in front of it. It wasn't sleeping. Its eyes remained half open, its head occasionally lifting as if scanning the surroundings. Lucas attempted to push himself upright, but a sharp, icy pain shot through his legs. He groaned, and the sound made the bear lift its head fully. For a moment, they stared at each other, man and beast, each on the edge of their own survival. Lucas's voice cracked as he whispered, "Why, are you still here?" The words were barely audible, yet speaking them made him feel alive again, as though reclaiming a small piece of himself from the cold. He tried to move his arms next, but numbness pinned them to his sides like invisible weights. Desperation tugged at him. He knew he couldn't stay in the snow much longer. Hypothermia had already taken root, its cold fingers wrapped around his muscles and lungs. He needed shelter. He needed fire. He needed warmth that the bear alone could not provide. Gathering what little strength he had, Lucas forced his elbow into the snow, attempting to push himself upward inch by inch. His body trembled, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The movement disturbed the bear, which rose to its feet with a heavy grunt. Snow slid from its back as it turned toward him. Lucas braced himself, fearing the sudden proximity, but instead of approaching him aggressively, the bear walked a few steps away, then looked back at him, once, twice, as though signaling. Lucas frowned through the haze of pain. He knew he might be imagining it, projecting meaning where none existed. But the bear's behavior was unmistakable. It wanted him to follow. Summoning all remaining strength, Lucas pushed himself onto his side, then onto his knees. His vision blurred, but he clenched his jaw and forced himself upright. Each movement burned like fire beneath his skin. He wasn't sure if his legs would support him, but he had no choice. The bear stood several feet ahead, watching him. When Lucas finally got to his feet, shaking, hunched, barely stable, the bear turned and began to walk. Not far, not quickly, just enough for Lucas to understand that he was meant to move in the same direction. Lucas breathed a shaky prayer, thanking God for anything, any sign, any guidance that could help him survive. Then he began to follow, stumbling through the snow, his muscles screaming with every step. The bear stayed several paces ahead, glancing back periodically, making sure he was still upright. The world around them had transformed. The storm had weakened, though the air remained brutally cold. Snowflakes drifted downward in slow, graceful spirals, settling on Lucas's eyelashes and melting on his skin. The landscape was a white labyrinth, endless hills, buried trees, and drifts that threatened to swallow them both whole. Lucas didn't know how far he could go. Every few steps, his knees buckled. More than once, he collapsed into the snow, panting, trembling, ready to surrender. But each time he fell, the bear would halt and look back at him, waiting, watching, allowing him the moments he needed to force himself upright once more. Lucas felt as though the creature had become both his companion and his conscience, refusing to let him give up even when his body begged to stop. At last, through the haze of cold and exhaustion, Lucas saw something ahead. Dark shapes rising from the snow. Trees, a dense cluster, their branches heavy with ice, but offering a promise of shelter from the open wind. The bear reached the tree line first and paused, glancing back at Lucas as though making sure he had seen it. Lucas's breath caught in his chest. The forest meant protection. It meant a chance to find fallen branches, dry patches beneath thick evergreens, maybe even a hollow to curl inside until the storm fully passed. Hope flickered in him, small but fierce. With renewed determination, he pushed forward, stumbling the last few steps into the shadow of the trees. The wind immediately softened, replaced by the muffled stillness of snow falling through branches. Inside the forest's embrace, Lucas collapsed against the trunk of a pine tree, his chest heaving. His entire body throbbed with pain, but he felt a fragile thread of safety weaving itself around him. The bear stood at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind a cluster of bushes, as though reluctant to come closer. For the first time, Lucas saw the creature clearly. Its ribs were sharp beneath its fur, its eyes sunken with hunger, its paws trembling slightly from exhaustion. It was suffering too. Lucas felt a deep ache in his heart. Not fear, not confusion, but compassion. He whispered hoarsely, "Thank you." The bear did not move, did not react, but its presence felt like a silent acknowledgement. A strange bond had formed between them, one born not from understanding, but from shared survival. As Lucas rested against the tree, fighting to stay conscious, he realized something profound. He was no longer thinking about the storm, or the cold, or the danger. He was thinking about purpose, about why the bear had stayed with him when instinct should have driven it away, about why he had survived long enough to reach shelter, about why, even in the crushing silence of the snow, he had felt the unmistakable touch of God upon his spirit. Lucas closed his eyes, letting the falling snow settle gently on his hair and shoulders. He knew the night was far from over. Survival would demand more of him, more strength, more faith, more courage. But for the first time since the storm began, he felt something warm inside him, something that refused to be extinguished. Hope. And as he drifted toward a fragile sleep, the last thing he saw was the bear, standing guard over him like a silent sentinel, unwilling to leave. The forest embraced Lucas Warren with a stillness so deep it felt almost sacred. Snowflakes drifted silently between the branches, creating a soft white curtain that muted the world beyond. The storm had calmed, but the cold remained merciless. Lucas sat slumped against the pine trunk, his breath shallow, his limbs numb. Yet inside that quiet sanctuary, he felt a fragile thread of life pulsing within him. The bear still lingered at the tree line, its dark silhouette barely visible through the snow. Lucas watched it with heavy eyes, still unable to understand why the creature had not abandoned him. The wilderness operated on cruel, simple laws. Only the strong survived. But something had made the starving bear stay. Whether instinct, confusion, or divine intervention, Lucas could not say. All he knew was that he was alive because of it. That truth alone pushed him to keep breathing, even when the cold urged him to surrender. The first task Lucas faced was regaining enough strength to move again, but his body resisted every attempt. Hypothermia had sunk deep into his muscles, turning even the smallest motion into agony. His fingers barely responded, stiff and pale beneath the layers of snow. He knew he needed warmth, fire, anything to stop the slow death creeping through him. Gathering his courage, he pressed his palm against the tree's rough bark, using it as leverage. His arms trembled violently. His breath hitched in painful gasps. Finally, he managed to push himself upright, though each passing second felt like his body might collapse again. The forest around him swayed in and out of focus. He blinked, forcing clarity into his vision. Beneath the snow, patches of dead pine needles hinted at sheltered areas where wood might be dry enough to burn. If he could reach them, there was hope. But before he could take even one step, a low growl rumbled through the forest. Lucas froze. The bear had stepped forward from the shadows, its head lowered, its gaze locked on him. For a heartbeat, fear stabbed into him, sharp, instinctive, primal. But the bear's posture didn't signal aggression. Its growl was not a threat. It was a warning. Lucas followed the bear's gaze toward the right, and his stomach tightened. Far beyond the trees, barely audible, came the distant cracking of ice. A shift in the storm's wake had weakened the frozen riverbed that snaked through the valley below. If he had wandered in that direction, he might have plunged through. Lucas swallowed hard, realizing the creature had just spared him from a fatal mistake. Slowly, almost reverently, he lowered himself back down against the tree. "Okay, I understand," he whispered, though he doubted the bear understood his words, but perhaps it understood his tone. Minutes passed as Lucas sat there, gathering strength. The bear retreated to its earlier position at the edge of the clearing, settling down with a tired sigh that made plumes of steam rise from its muzzle. Lucas watched the creature with a growing sense of empathy. It was suffering too, starving, desperate, likely exhausted from the storm's relentless grip. Yet it had chosen to stay near him, as though tethered to his survival by some invisible bond. The thought moved Lucas deeply. He had always believed that nature followed cycles of scarcity and survival, but witnessing this act of unexpected companionship, made him rethink everything he thought he knew. Animals weren't supposed to behave this way. But then again, humans weren't always predictable either. Trauma, hunger, and loneliness could bind even strangers in ways logic couldn't explain. Eventually, Lucas forced himself to try again. He braced his hands against the pine trunk, pushed, and rose to his feet. This time, he managed to stay upright longer. His legs trembled violently beneath him, but they held. He leaned heavily on the tree as he scanned the forest floor. There, beneath a thick cluster of pines, lay a patch of ground where snow had not fully reached, sheltered by dense branches overhead. Dry needles and small branches poked through the surface. Perfect. If he could gather enough, he could build a fire. That fire meant warmth, clarity, a chance to stay alive until morning. Lucas looked toward the bear, almost as if asking for permission. The creature watched him but didn't move. Taking that as a silent approval, Lucas staggered forward toward the sheltered patch. Each step was a battle. His boots sank into the snow with dull thuds, and every movement sent shivers tearing through his spine. His breath came out in broken clouds, but he kept going. When he reached the sheltered area, he collapsed to his knees and began clumsily scooping together the driest branches he could find. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the pieces. Still, he persisted. He gathered pine needles, small sticks, and fallen twigs, anything that might catch flame. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, driven by pure willpower rather than strength. As he worked, he could feel the bear's eyes on him, its presence like a silent guardian under the darkening sky. Lucas tried not to think about how vulnerable he was, kneeling there with his back exposed. He forced trust into the space between them, thin but genuine, because fear would only steal precious energy he didn't have. Once he had enough material, Lucas struggled to carry it all back to the tree. He dropped the pile beside him, panting heavily. Now came the hardest part, starting the fire. His fingers were dangerously numb, and his lighter, if he still had it, would be buried somewhere deep inside his backpack. He groaned softly as he reached for the straps, his stiff hands fumbling with the frozen buckles. It took longer than it should have, but eventually, he managed to pull the pack into his lap. Snow clung to the fabric in thick crusts. Lucas dug through the contents, trembling with desperation. Finally, his fingers brushed against cold metal. The lighter. He pulled it out with a shaky exhale of relief, but fear clawed at him. If the lighter was wet or frozen, it might not work. He held it close to his chest for a long moment, warming it with his breath. Then, with a whispered plea for mercy, he flicked it. A weak spark danced in the air. Once, twice, then, miraculously, the flame caught. A tiny, flickering ember of hope. Lucas leaned forward, shielding the flame from the wind with shaking hands, and guided it toward the pine needles. They resisted at first, damp from the cold, but the flame persisted. Slowly, the needles began to crackle, embers glowing. Lucas coaxed them gently, blowing warm air over them until the fire grew strong enough to ignite the small twigs. Flames climbed upward, brightening the clearing with golden light. Warmth seeped into Lucas's frozen skin, and he bowed his head, overwhelmed with relief. Tears threatened to fall, but they froze before they could reach his cheeks. As the fire strengthened, Lucas felt life returning to his limbs, softening the brutal numbness that had been consuming him. The light of the fire revealed more of the bear's form. It still lingered at the border of the clearing, watching the flames with a mixture of caution and fascination. The glow illuminated the creature's gaunt frame, the deep lines of hunger etched into its body. Lucas felt a pang of guilt. He had warmth now, a small miracle of survival, while the bear had nothing but the cold. Without thinking, he reached into his pack and pulled out the last ration bar he had managed to save from the storm. It was small, barely enough for a single meal, but he held it in his hand for a long moment, then gently broke it in half. With trembling fingers, he slid one half across the snow toward the bear. The creature hesitated, sniffing the air, then stepped closer. Slowly, carefully, it stopped several feet from Lucas, bent its head, and delicately picked up the piece. Lucas watched as the bear chewed, tentatively, then hungrily. When it finished, it looked at Lucas with something that felt almost like acknowledgement. As the fire crackled softly, the night deepened. Lucas huddled close to the flames, his body finally warming, his spirit slowly lifting from the edge of despair. The bear lay down again at the edge of the clearing, closer now but still cautious. Between them, an unspoken pact seemed to settle, a fragile coexistence born of necessity and something deeper. Lucas gazed into the dark forest, the embers casting gentle shadows across the snow. The storm had passed, but danger still lurked everywhere. The freezing temperatures, the possibility of frostbite, exhaustion, and the long journey ahead. But for the first time since he had been buried beneath the snow, Lucas felt he might actually survive. Not because he was strong, not because he was prepared, but because he wasn't alone. Not truly. And as he drifted into an uneasy sleep beside the fire, the last thing he saw was the bear's silhouette. Silent, watchful, unwavering. Morning arrived quietly, with a pale gray light slipping through the canopy of pines and settling over the clearing. Lucas Warren stirred beneath the fading glow of the fire's last embers, his body stiff, but no longer trapped in the suffocating grip of hypothermia. Every muscle ached, as though he had been carved from ice. But he could feel warmth in his fingertips again. A precious victory. The snow around him sparkled faintly under the muted dawn, untouched except for the tracks he and the bear had left during the night. Lucas pushed himself upright and winced as his joints protested. The bear was still there, lying a short distance away, its massive body curled into a protective arc, facing the forest. Lucas watched its slow breathing, each exhale rising in a small cloud of steam. For a moment he wondered if the creature had stayed awake most of the night keeping watch. The idea felt almost too hopeful, almost human. But still, he couldn't ignore the sense that something profound had tied their fates together. The fire needed rebuilding, but Lucas knew his greater priority was mobility. He couldn't afford to linger in one spot for too long. Exposure, starvation, or another storm could end him before help ever came. The fire had bought him time, not safety. He needed to move south toward the river valley where search teams were more likely to pass. Yet the moment he tried to stand, a wave of dizziness crashed over him. He staggered and had to brace himself against the pine trunk, breathing through the spinning in his head. His body was still dangerously weak. Even thinking about walking felt like a gamble he might lose. When he finally steadied himself, he glanced at the bear. The creature had lifted its head, watching him with quiet intensity. There was no threat in its posture, only a strange awareness, as if it understood his fragile condition. Lucas gave it a faint nod, unsure whether it mattered, but grateful nonetheless. He could move, just barely. And that had to be enough. Before leaving the clearing, Lucas scavenged every remaining scrap of usable material he could find. He repacked his bag with trembling hands, carefully tucking away the lighter, his emergency blanket, and the last fragments of food. The forest was breathtaking in its stillness, frosted branches bowing under the weight of snow, a gentle wind whispering through the needles above, the distant groan of shifting ice echoing like a ghostly warning. Lucas took one last look at the small fire pit that had kept him alive, then turned toward the open forest. The bear rose too, its breath puffing in slow, rhythmic bursts. For an instant, Lucas feared it might follow him aggressively, but instead, it simply stood there, watching him. Not stalking, not guarding, just watching. Lucas met its gaze, feeling a strange pull in his chest, a sense of farewell that made no logical sense but felt deeply real. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He didn't know if the bear understood. But after a pause, it lowered its head softly, almost like a bow. The trek through the forest was brutal. The snowdrifts were deeper than he expected, swallowing his boots with each step and forcing him to exert energy he barely had. Every few yards he had to stop to catch his breath, leaning on tree trunks or fallen branches to steady himself. His legs trembled with exhaustion, and the cold gnawed at his skin, slipping beneath his layers like icy needles. But the forest was changing, subtly, but enough for him to notice. The terrain sloped downward. The trees grew denser and faint animal tracks marked the snow. Civilization was still far, but this was at least a sign of life, of movement, of possibility. Lucas pressed on, clutching the straps of his backpack as though it anchored him to reality. As he stumbled forward, his mind replayed the night behind him, the fire, the bear, the silent watchfulness they had shared. He felt as though he had left a part of himself in that clearing, some fragile spark of humility he hadn't known he possessed. Hours passed, each minute dragging him deeper into exhaustion. His throat was dry, painfully so. The cold air had scraped it raw, and he knew dehydration was creeping up on him like an invisible threat. Snow could help, but only minimally. It cooled his mouth but offered little sustenance. Still, he scooped a handful into his palm and let it melt on his tongue, ignoring the burn of cold that accompanied it. As he trudged onward, he began noticing broken branches and disturbed patches of snow that suggested something large had moved through the forest earlier. The thought of encountering another predator made his pulse quicken, but he pushed the fear aside. The wilderness didn't care about his fear. It didn't care about his hope either. Survival depended on forward motion, one foot in front of the other, even when every instinct begged him to stop and collapse. Eventually, the distant sound of rushing water reached him. Lucas froze, his breath hitching. Water meant a lifeline, hydration, orientation, possibly even traces of human presence. He followed the sound, navigating through clusters of fallen trees and heavy drifts until the forest opened into a narrow ravine. At its center flowed a partially frozen stream, its icy surface cracked in places where the current pushed through. Lucas approached cautiously, kneeling beside the water's edge. He cupped his hands and dipped them into the frigid stream, gasping at the shock before bringing the water to his lips. It was painfully cold, but pure and refreshing enough to revive his senses. He drank slowly, carefully, until he felt some strength seep back into him. Then he washed his face, letting the cold jolt him awake. The forest around him seemed to brighten, a small illusion of hope born from the simple act of drinking. But hope was fragile, easily shattered. As Lucas rose to his feet, his eyes caught movement among the trees on the opposite side of the ravine. His breath stilled. A shape shifted between the shadows, a tall, hulking silhouette that moved with deliberate slowness. The bear, the same one. Lucas recognized its ragged fur, its gaunt frame, the emptiness of hunger etched into its posture. Somehow, it had followed him. Or maybe it had simply taken the same path through the forest, drawn by the scent of water or the natural flow of the terrain. Lucas didn't know. What he did know was that it didn't approach. It simply watched him, just as it had the night before. The river lay between them like an invisible boundary neither would cross. Lucas held its gaze for a long moment, unsure whether he should feel fear or comfort. But the bear's posture remained neutral, tired, wary, but not aggressive. It blinked once, slowly, then lowered its head and turned away, disappearing into the shadows as silently as mist. The encounter left Lucas shaken. Why had the bear followed? Coincidence? Territory? Or something deeper, some instinctive tether that had not yet broken? No answer came. Lucas forced himself to continue downstream, following the river's natural curve. The sun hovered low, casting long shadows through the trees, painting the snow in shades of blue and silver. The temperature dropped steadily as afternoon bled into evening. Lucas knew he needed shelter before nightfall. The forest floor here was too exposed, too open to the brutal winds that would soon sweep through. He scanned the landscape desperately, searching for anything that could shield him. A rock formation, a cluster of fallen logs, even a natural dip in the terrain. His muscles burned with fatigue, and his vision blurred at the edges. Finally, he spotted a formation of large boulders nestled together at the base of a small hill, forming a shallow cave. Relief washed over him. He didn't care if it was cramped or cold. It was shelter, and shelter meant survival. Inside the small cavern, Lucas shook the snow from his clothes and lowered himself onto a flat patch of ground. The space was tight enough that the wind couldn't reach him, and the rock walls trapped some of his body heat. He gathered a few fallen twigs from the entrance, but there wasn't nearly enough to start a real fire. Instead, he wrapped himself tightly in his emergency blanket, pulling his knees close to his chest. His breath echoed softly off the stone, steady but shallow. The exhaustion hit him like a wave, stealing the last remnants of strength from his limbs. Yet sleep did not come easily. His mind replayed every moment of the day. The struggle to stand, the trek through the forest, the river, the bear watching him from across the ravine. A strange mixture of fear and gratitude churned inside him. That creature could have killed him, could have consumed him. Yet it hadn't. It had followed him, silently guarding the edges of his journey. But why? Was it mere curiosity or something far greater than instinct? Night settled slowly over the forest, filling the world with a deep, heavy silence. Lucas closed his eyes, listening to the distant wind scraping across the snowdrifts. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted, a haunting, lonely sound that echoed through the trees. Lucas shivered beneath his blanket, feeling the cold seep into his bones once more. But this time he didn't feel the same crushing hopelessness that had nearly broken him days before. He had water. He had a shelter. He had made it another day. And as he drifted into a restless sleep, he wondered if the bear was still somewhere out there, moving through the darkness, watching over him in ways he couldn't understand. The thought comforted him, even as it frightened him. In the midst of the endless white wilderness, two suffering creatures had crossed paths and forged a fragile, improbable connection. Whether fate, instinct, or divine design, Lucas didn't know, but he knew this. Tomorrow, he would keep moving. And somewhere in the cold silence of the forest, the bear would be moving too. The night seemed endless as Lucas Warren lay trapped beneath the collapsed snow chamber that had become both his prison and his shelter. The storm had eased, but the cold had not relented. Every breath he exhaled felt thinner, weaker, drifting into the narrow pocket of air like a fading whisper. Above him, the starving bear still paced, its shadow shifting faintly through the snow. Lucas couldn't see it, but he felt its weight, sensed its presence like a slow, predatory heartbeat pressing into the earth. The cold gnawed deeper into his bones, but something else crept in as well, a numbness that felt disturbingly peaceful. He fought to keep his mind awake, terrified that if he drifted into sleep, he would never wake again. His hands trembled uncontrollably, and his pulse fluttered like a dying flame, threatening to extinguish altogether. Lucas thought of warmth. Not physical warmth, but the emotional fire that had kept him moving through every hour of this ordeal. He remembered the life he had promised himself he would return to. His parents' cabin. The guitar he hadn't played in months. The half-finished letter he kept telling himself he would revise someday. Small things, perhaps, but now they felt monumental. Anchors holding him to existence. He clung to those memories like a lifeline. The bear's heavy steps shifted again, snow cracking faintly beneath its paws. Lucas knew the animal wasn't waiting to attack. It was waiting to feed. The instinctual truth chilled him more than the ice surrounding his body. If he died here, he would not die alone. Something desperate and starving would consume what was left. But as dawn approached, something changed in the bear's behavior. The pacing stopped. The ground grew still. Lucas held his breath, expecting the worst, a sudden collapse of snow or the violent tearing of claws. Instead, he heard something unexpected, a series of distant, irregular thuds. At first he thought he was hallucinating. Then he heard them again, rhythmic, human, tools cracking through frozen layers, voices faint but unmistakable. His heart surged. Rescuers, real ones, not imagined, not dreamed about. The bear must have sensed them too, because a deep guttural snarl rumbled through the earth, vibrating against Lucas's frozen ribs. Then came the explosive sound of snow scattering above him. The bear was fleeing. The snow above began to tremble. Light, actual light, bled through a widening crack overhead. Lucas blinked against the brightness, tears leaking unbidden from the corners of his eyes. The voices grew clearer, louder, closer. Someone shouted his name. Another yelled for rope. The opening widened further until a gloved hand reached through, sweeping away loose powder. "We found him," the rescuer yelled, breathless and awed. "He's alive." Lucas tried to speak, but only a rasp escaped. The rescuers lowered a harness, and multiple hands reached down to grip his arms, their touch warm even through thick gloves. It was the first warmth Lucas had felt in days. His body shook violently, not from cold, but from the overwhelming shock of being saved. As they pulled him up through the narrow tunnel, Lucas glimpsed the outside world for the first time in what felt like years. The sky was pale blue, fragile and soft, like a painting brushed with morning light. Snow stretched in every direction, untouched except for the deep scars cut by the rescue team. And in the distance, he saw it. A massive brown bear limping toward the tree line, its ribs visible beneath its fur, pausing once to glance back. It didn't roar, it didn't charge. It simply looked, as if acknowledging the end of something ancient and primal. Predator and prey no longer bound by the brutal terms of survival. Then it vanished into the forest. Lucas collapsed into the rescuer's arms the moment they hauled him free, his legs unable to support him. They wrapped him in thermal blankets, their voices urgent but gentle as they checked his pulse, his temperature, his breathing. "Severe hypothermia," one murmured. "Frostbite on both hands." "He's lucky to be alive," another whispered. Lucas didn't feel lucky. Not yet. He felt hollow, as if the ordeal had carved out parts of him that had not grown back. But the warmth spreading through his body told him something else. He was alive. Truly alive. That reality alone felt like a miracle. They carried him to a waiting snowmobile, then transferred him to a rescue helicopter. As the blades roared overhead and lifted the craft into the sky, Lucas gazed down at the landscape that had nearly consumed him. The snow glittered in the sunlight, serene and beautiful. Nothing like the monstrous, suffocating wilderness he had endured. The helicopter tilted, and for a moment he caught sight of the site where he had been trapped. It looked so small now, so insignificant. The place where he had fought for every breath had become just another patch of snow in an endless white expanse. At the nearest hospital, doctors worked quickly to stabilize him. Heated IV fluids, warm blankets, monitors beeping steadily. As his body thawed and sensation slowly returned to his fingers and toes, so did the weight of everything he had survived. Nurses asked him questions, but he could barely process them. His mind drifted between moments. Fox tracks in the snow, the sound of the bear breathing above him, the echo of rescuers' voices breaking through the cold silence. Sometimes he shivered, sometimes he cried without realizing it. But always he kept coming back to the same thought. He had not died in that hole. He had not surrendered to the cold. Something inside him had refused. As the days passed, Lucas regained strength. Friends and family visited, their faces blurred by emotion as they embraced him. He listened to their words, but part of him still lived in that frozen world, still hearing the steady steps of the starving bear. He didn't fear the animal anymore, not the way most people might expect. Instead, he felt an odd, almost spiritual connection to it. They had both been trapped by hunger, by cold, by forces beyond their control. They had watched each other breathe through death's doorway. They had survived, not together but parallel, like two threads crossing in the fabric of a brutal winter. When Lucas was finally discharged, he stepped outside and felt sunlight on his skin without the sting of frostbite or the weight of despair. He inhaled deeply, savoring the simple act of breathing freely, without fear of the cold stealing it away. He walked slowly, still recovering, but each step was deliberate, grounded, alive. He glanced toward the distant mountains, their peaks shimmering white. He didn't hate them. He didn't fear them. In a strange, indescribable way, he honored them. They had tested him, mercilessly, violently, but he had endured. And though the world would remember his ordeal as the story of a man stalked by a starving bear beneath the snow, Lucas Warren would remember it differently, as the moment he discovered a strength inside himself he never knew existed. As Lucas Warren stepped back into the world beyond his hospital room, he carried with him the echoes of a battle that had reshaped the very core of who he was. The snow no longer symbolized the icy tomb that had nearly claimed his life, but the unforgiving stage upon which he discovered a resilience he hadn't known resided within him. He thought of the collapsed chamber where he had counted each freezing breath, and of the starving bear whose relentless presence had kept him suspended between life and death. Though the world would remember that animal as a threat, Lucas understood it differently now. The bear had been a reflection of the wilderness itself, merciless, instinctive, and honest in its struggle to survive. And in that brutal honesty, Lucas found a strange form of clarity, a reminder that life is never guaranteed, yet always worth fighting for. In the weeks that followed his rescue, Lucas often found himself pausing in the warmth of his home, marveling at the small, ordinary miracles people seldom notice, the steady hum of a heater, the softness of a blanket, the comforting aroma of a hot meal. These simple comforts felt sacred after the bitter cold had stripped him of certainty and warmth. He spoke little about the bear, though its image remained carved into his memory. Its breathing above him, its silent retreat when the rescuers approached, its final glance before disappearing into the forest. Lucas didn't see cruelty in that creature anymore. He saw a fellow survivor pushed to the edge of endurance. He knew their paths had crossed, not by chance, but by the raw, unfiltered reality of the wild. And though he never wished to relive those 7 frozen days, he could not deny the strange gratitude that had taken root within him. The ordeal had forced him to confront his own limits, and in doing so, revealed strengths he had never tested before. As life slowly settled back into rhythm, Lucas made a silent vow: to live with intention, to breathe deeply, and to carry forward the lessons carved into him by snow, hunger, and fear. Some nights he would step outside beneath the stars, letting the cold brush against his skin just long enough to remind him of the thin line he had walked. But instead of dread, he felt purpose. He had survived the kind of cold that steals breath, the kind of isolation that fractures hope, and the watchful presence of a predator driven by desperation. And in surviving, Lucas discovered something he could never have found in comfort, an unshakable understanding that even in moments of profound vulnerability, the human spirit has the power to endure. His story was no longer just a tale of survival. It was a testament to what remains inside a person when the world strips everything else away.